For this episode of the Books and Parchments podcast, we're continuing to bring to you the book, Nehemiah, Restoring the Testimony of God, by Kaung. We were given permission by Christian Fellowship Publishers to produce this entire audiobook, so be sure to catch each episode in its right order. Here is Chapter 3, Nehemiah's Burden. Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. And it came to pass, in the month Kislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the fortress, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came, he and certain men of Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, who were left of the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, Those who remain, that are left of the captivity there in the province, are in great affliction and reproach. And the wall of Jerusalem is in ruins, and its gates are burned with fire. And it came to pass, when I heard these words, that I sat and wept, and mourned for days, and fasted, and prayed before the God of the heavens, and said, I beseech thee, Jehovah, God of the heavens, the great and terrible God, that keepeth covenant and mercy for them that love him and keep his commandments. Let thine ear now be attentive, and thine eyes open, to hear the prayer of thy servant, which I pray before thee at this time, day and night, for the children of Israel thy servants, confessing the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against thee. Both I and my father's house have sinned. We have acted very perversely against thee, and have not kept the commandments, nor the statutes, nor the ordinances that thou commandedst thy servant Moses. Remember, I beseech thee, the word that thou commandedst thy servant Moses, saying, If ye act unfaithfully, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if ye return to me, and keep my commandments, and do them, though there were of you cast out unto the uttermost part of the heavens, yet will I gather them from thence, and will bring them unto the place that I have chosen to set my name there. And they are thy servants and thy people, whom thou hast redeemed by thy great power and by thy strong hand. O Lord, I beseech thee, let now thine ear be attentive to the prayer of thy servant, and to the prayer of thy servants who delight to fear thy name. And prosper, I pray thee, thy servant this day, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man. Now I was the king's cupbearer. As you open the book of Nehemiah, the timing for his story is around 80 years or 75 years after the first return of the remnant of Israel under Zerubbabel. Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the king, who in secular history is known as Artaxerxes Longimanus. Today we may think a cupbearer is a mere waiter, but in those days, a cupbearer was one of the highest officials in the court. Why? Kings in those times were tyrants, and tyrants were always afraid that people would murder them by poisoning. So before they would drink from the cupbearer would drink it first, and then hand it to the king. There must be such closeness between the cupbearer and the king. The cupbearer was the confidant of the king, a close friend of the king. The king trusted his life to the cupbearer, and the cupbearer was willing to give up his life for the king. If there was any poison in the cup, then he died for the king. So there must be such an intimate relationship between the king and the cupbearer. He must have been a trusted friend, a bosom friend of the king. The Persian court at that time was the highest in the world because of the Persian Empire. To be in the Persian court and to occupy such a high position almost next to the king meant that he lived a life of comfort and luxury. Though he was a Jew, he lacked nothing whatsoever, but his heart was in Jerusalem. If he were free to go back, he would be in Jerusalem, just like his brother Hananiah. But he couldn't go to Jerusalem since he was the cupbearer. When he wanted to go back, he had to get permission from the king to go. Nehemiah couldn't go, but his heart was there. He was concerned with the conditions of the remnant there. He was like Daniel. Even though Daniel was in Babylon, his heart was in Jerusalem. Every day he opened the window towards Jerusalem and prayed 3 times a day. Dear brothers and sisters, where is your heart? You may have been providentially placed somewhere different than a spiritual Jerusalem, but where is your heart? To be where God wants you to be where you should be, to be in Jerusalem spiritually for the testimony of God. This is the place where every faithful one must be. And I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, who were left of the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, Those who remain, that are left of the captivity there in the province, are in great affliction and reproach, and the wall of Jerusalem is in ruins, and its gates are burned with fire. Chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. His brother Hananiah and some others came back from Jerusalem for a visit, and they brought back news to Nehemiah. Nehemiah was anxious to hear the news. What happened to those who remained in Jerusalem? Remember that the temple had been built 50 or 55 years earlier, but they were in such affliction and reproach because the city lay in ruins. There was no wall. The gates were burned. There was no protection. Enemies surrounded them. There was a temple, and yet it was exposed. Many who originally returned now probably had come back to Babylon because of the danger. If you read carefully, it says, those who escaped and remained. At first, a remnant went to Jerusalem to be where God wanted them to be. Then, as it became so difficult, and they became so discouraged, they packed up and returned. But thank God, there were still some hanging on. It was difficult. They were in great affliction and reproach, but they held on. They surrounded the temple. They refused to go away. They had no place to go. They were where they should be. Where else could they go? But they were in great difficulties, in much affliction and reproach. There was no protection for them. They could be annihilated at any moment. When Nehemiah heard this, he sat down and wept. He prayed, he fasted for days and nights. He was so concerned. He went to the Lord. Despite being in the Persian court, well protected and the favorite of the king, he could not forget his brethren. No, his heart was there in Jerusalem. Oh, he was just like Moses. When Moses grew up, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He would rather suffer together with his brethren. He esteemed the reproaches of the Christ as more precious than all the riches of Egypt, because he had seen the unseen. Hebrews 11, verses 24 through 27. This was Nehemiah as well. He did not put himself in a different position from his brethren. His heart was one with the suffering remnant. He confessed his sin and his father's sin. He confessed for all Israel. He pleaded with God, and as he pleaded with God, God's call came to him. Go back to rebuild the wall. Brothers and sisters, what is the concern of your heart today? Is it that since you live comfortably, you do not care for the testimony of Jesus? True, it will be difficult for those who want to maintain the testimony of Jesus. There are many afflictions and reproaches. They are on the verge of spiritual annihilation. Do you give yourself to prayer? Do you plead with God on their behalf? If you do, I believe the burden of the Lord will come upon you, as with Nehemiah, to go back and rebuild the wall. The life of God's people together needs to be rebuilt. That is the testimony, the spiritual wall of the city. Nehemiah received a burden from the Lord, and he prayed, Lord, let me be found in favor with that man. And that man was the king. Remember that the king is but a man. Nehemiah knew the Lord called him to go back to rebuild the wall, but he did not move on his own. He waited upon God as a few months passed. Sometimes if we feel we have received some mission from God, we immediately move out. But if we know God, we will not do that. Nehemiah waited upon God patiently. Every day the burden became heavier. Maybe after a few months, if you don't have faith, you will wonder whether you will ever go. And during all those months, as he served the cup before the king, he had to put on a joyful face. His heart was crying, but he must smile. He tried not to show his sorrow and burden until a few months passed. Then one day, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, as he lifted the cup, the king noticed his face was sad. The king said, Why is your face sad? There must be something that troubles you. Nehemiah was afraid because no one can appear before the king with a sad face, especially the cupbearer. Why? If the cupbearer should appear before the king with a sad face, then the king immediately would become suspicious. It was a capital crime. But Nehemiah couldn't help it. After a few months, he just couldn't restrain himself anymore, so he lifted his heart to God before he answered the king. God heard his prayer and gave him this opportunity. Nehemiah said, O king, how can I be glad when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, are in ruins? The king said, What do you want? Let me go back, rebuild the city, rebuild the wall. The king said, How long will you be away? And when will you return? He gave him a set time, and it pleased the king to send him. The good hand of his God was upon him, and the king let him go. How we need to wait upon the Lord. If we wait upon the Lord, he will open the way for us to rebuild the wall of the unity of the brethren together. You've been listening to Nehemiah by Stephen Kaung. For more on this book and other books by Stephen Kaung, you can visit our website, booksandparchments.com, or find us on Facebook or Instagram at Books and Parchments. May the Lord encourage you and be encouraged by you.